Well, we're very happy to have with us today, as you'll see appear on the screen. We've got Felicity Gray, who is director at the Property Practice. Now, Felicity, among other things, of course, specialises in property, and that's a hot topic as always, right? It's usually a key or a cornerstone investment that most New Zealanders have. So we're just going to run through a few things. Welcome, Felicity. Nice to have you with us.
Thanks for having me, Gareth.
Now, we've hatched a cunning plan today. These are the things we're hoping to talk about. One, the current market. Two, some thoughts, I guess, about listing observations from the coalface. Also, tune in a bit later because Felicity will have some suggestions for well-prepared buyers and sellers. So if you're one of those, you want to pay attention there. A little bit on tax statements because we've heard that lawyers feed stuff through to IRD, but that's sort of a bit of a mystery to most of us. And then lastly, what about these things we've been seeing in the media lately, that is sunset clauses and force majeure? I've seen that word written before. How do you say that? So look out for a very small French lesson later, with apologies to French speakers everywhere. Anyway, let's get right into that first part there, Felicity. The market listings, what are you seeing? What are your thoughts on that at the moment?
Well, it does seem like the recent interest rate hikes and more stringent lending criteria are having a little bit of an impact, as most people probably suspect. It does potentially place buyers in a better position moving forward in terms of their negotiations than has been the case over the last couple of years, which is good. There does seem to also be more listings on the market in January than perhaps what you sometimes might expect, which is interesting. Perhaps some baby boomer investors are getting out while the going is good.
Now, that's interesting, your comment there. So I guess you're probably seeing, would it be fair to say, like 4 to 6 weeks before it hits the media, you're already seeing the results of law changes and on day-to-day transactions?
I think that typically would be the time frame which the media lags by in terms of seeing changes come through. So perhaps about a month or 6 weeks before Christmas, things maybe started to turn a little bit, which is now being reported in the media.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. Okay, so when you see it in the news, it's already old news. It's not breaking news, no matter what the websites say. Yeah. Okay. And I guess it's not all bad news then, because it has been perhaps a buyer's market for a long time, but that's arguable perhaps. But things are changing a bit, perhaps in favour of there's not so many buyers now, so it makes it easy for the seller to get a better price. Unless, of course...
Hold on. Vendor's market.
Let's use the right terminology. I stand corrected, folk. Okay, vendors.
Are you doing this to make me feel better, Gareth?
No, definitely not. Yeah, and we keep it on recording. So a vendor's market. Okay, that's great. So tell us, what does that mean? What's a vendor's market? For the likes of us that are like, well, there's a buyer and a seller. What's a vendor? And what does it mean then it's a vendor's market?
A lot of properties obviously are being sold by auction. It makes it very difficult with people. You buy unconditionally at auction. Obviously, for first-time home buyers, the common complaint is they have to spend a lot of money on their DD checks, the due diligence checks, with no guarantees. This might be a little bit controversial, but any Muppet real estate agent can sell a property well, perhaps in the vendor's market. But on the other hand, if things moving forward are less, if things are being auctioned less, there's more sale of property with an asking price or by negotiation. It does mean that for savvy, well-prepared buyers, that can create a real advantage in those circumstances potentially. But certain properties will always be very popular and therefore quite competitive. But, generally speaking, if more properties are going to be sold by negotiation or with an asking price moving forward rather than by auction, well-prepared and savvy buyers can create a real advantage for themselves in those circumstances.
Aha. All right. Let's just so I've got this straight in my head. So vendor a bit, in Spanish, the vender is the word to sell. Okay, so that's the person selling, right? We got that in case anyone watching was confused. So that means that's a bit better for them at the moment. And because not so many things are going to auction because banks are pulling approvals left, right, and centre and all sorts of things, maybe more stuff by negotiation instead. Yeah.
So I do think that having commercially savvy advisors can actually go a long way in these times to make a big difference for people. I do always suggest to purchaser clients that as soon as they find a property that they like, to ring me so that we can discuss the best strategic way forward. It obviously depends on the particular property and how competitive it is, but buyers need to realise that it's not just the price that they offer on a property which can influence a vendor. It's obviously the conditions that they submit with their offer as well. So if a buyer can get themselves into a position of being condition free, or just at least having as few conditions as possible with short time frames, then that can be a really powerful thing and can influence a vendor quite a lot.
Now that's interesting, because a few weeks ago, it's probably more than a few weeks ago, but we had a chat to Angela Little, and she made the same comment, that if you're a buyer and you're cashed up, you're always in a much stronger position. So it's interesting to hear the same message come through from your perspective there, Felicity, doing property all day, every day.
For sure. And the same thing goes for vendors in this type of market as well. I mean, it's just critical that they have good advisors so that they can get their ducks in a row and get them in a row really quickly. It's really important that you have an agent who understands how to run a sales campaign really effectively, so that it makes it really competitive and creates a sense of urgency. I mean, vendors only get one chance to sell their property properly, to get the best result. So they need, and the agent needs to understand how to negotiate properly. And dare I say, they also need someone who actually genuinely cares about getting the best result for their client.
Yeah, okay. Now that's interesting too, because just chatting to some real estate agents recently, they have made that distinction between those that are just trying to clip the ticket and get things through in like a warehouse approach, and the agent. I was chatting to Mike McCall from International Realtor. He said, but actually you've got to try and get the best price for the client rather than just get him through. So I thought, okay, yes, there is differences of view amongst real estate agents, so it does require getting the right person. I like their point. So contact your lawyer straight away when you're buying a house. Don't muck around about that. Does that happen much, that you get, Felicity, we're buying a house like in 3 hours, can you pull a rabbit out of the hat? Does that happen?
Yes, I've had a few instances of that lately. I mean, it's funny because some people obviously maybe are intimidated by contacting a professional like you or I, you're me, or they're worried about the cost, but it's always much better in terms of preventing problems and maximising the best strategy to call sooner rather than later. And I know that, most professionals like you and I, Gareth, just care much more about clients getting a really good result than we care about turning on the time clock.
Yeah, it's a long-term relationship. Okay, well, those are some really good sort of insights, just, I guess, from what's happening, what has been happening. And I guess it's common sense, isn't it? Good preparation, engage with your team of professionals as soon as possible. It just makes sense. But perhaps because, I don't know if it's been worse over the last year, under pressure, COVID, yada, yada, that perhaps was like, have you rung the lawyer? No, I thought you did. That maybe that sort of thing happens. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So well prepared, that's like the buzzword. Whether you're buying or selling, be well prepared.
Yes, and especially in the current climate where it might be a bit more difficult for vendors to be just selling their property at auction for crazy prices, like has been the case in the Auckland market for the last couple of years.
Okay. Do you care to make, we won't hold you to this, do you care to make any prediction about whether this borrowing climate will ease, and if so, when? I'm putting her on the spot there.
Yeah, completely. From what I hear from other professionals, I mean, it's a case of the banks kind of easing into things and understanding the rule changes, and then just having their policies align with them more. And then, maybe that might take a few months, but that it won't become so dramatic once they ease into that, and that things might relax a little bit.
Right, okay. Yeah, it does remind me a bit of when I was learning to drive, and that was a manual, and the start's very jerky, and, Dad's cracking up as I'm sort of stalling the car. And then after a while, you get used to driving it smoothly. And I do wonder if the banks have found themselves in that position a bit of learning to drive a manual almost from scratch, So it's all a bit jerky and stop-start. And yeah, no one's laughing, unfortunately.
No, you don't want to get a telling off from Jacinda.
Right, okay. Especially if you're Neve. So let's move on to the next thing, and this is to do with something I've always wondered about, tax statements. You see, as an accountant, I know that some information is given to IRD, but I really have no idea what do lawyers tell IRD. So that's what I mean. It's like a veil is drawn over this part of life. And can you pull that back and just give us a little bit of an insight into what's happening behind the scenes there?
Sure. So for all property transactions now that involve a transfer of ownership, all lawyers have to prepare a tax statement electronically in LINS. So for the buyer and the seller, and regardless of whether it's a main home exemption or not, in terms of the property taxation legislation, or what's more commonly known as the bright line test rules, all entities have to have an IRD number as well. So this tax statement information that we submit at the time a property settlement goes through gets fed into LINS, and from what I understand, it gets fed straight away into IRD as well. So that, of course, does enable the IRD to monitor that people are obviously complying and being truthful in terms of the property taxation rules and in terms of what they're doing with their property transactions.
Okay, now just if you missed that little moniker there, LINS is not a Kiwi woman middle-aged living in Tawa with quite a broad Kiwi accent, right? But that's Land Information New Zealand. Yeah, that's what came to mind as you're saying LINS. Hello, love. Thinking of Lynn of Tawa. So that's really feeding that information through IDs now, all connected to that. Yeah. So interestingly enough, what happens from, I guess, our end is that when the tax returns go in under these situations where a property is caught by a bright line test, we then have to submit, I think it's an IR 833, something like that. Anyway, it's the form that shows, etc., what the taxable result is going to be and how we got to that. So that then obviously is all going to marry up that form with what's come through from the lawyer, and then IRD knows either, okay, there's tax to pay, or there's nothing here, just move along.
And Gareth, do you know if IRD is very active yet in monitoring all these transactions, or?
Well, interestingly enough, it would be well over a year ago we were sent a list in PDF of here are all your clients where we believe they are subject to the bright line test. We encourage them to fill in this IR 833 or make a voluntary declaration. So we just started working through that, and some of them there was a main home exemption, some of them, yes, it was caught by bright line, but there was no taxable profit, etc. Most of the situations there, I don't think we came across anything which was an issue, because typically, most of the time, clients are engaging with us beforehand because they don't want to be caught by tax. So that told us they'd been fed a list of, it was the property identification number, the address, the IRD number. It was detailed information for probably, I don't know, a good 40 or 50 clients. So, yeah, they were acting on it. Since then, I haven't seen anything. So it's like an initial data dump. Let's reach out and see what comes from that through the accountants, whether they're now contacting people directly or not. But it shows the mechanism is working.
It's interesting. There was an article in the Herald last week about the complications that the bright line test can cause for parents who are participating in ownership of properties with their children in order to help them onto the property ladder. And the article was a bit misleading in one respect, which the people in the comments, of course, corrected quickly. But it did. I have had that situation in recent weeks, and it does sort of highlight how much more complicated property transactions are by virtue of the bright line stuff in various types of circumstances. But at the same time, once again, there are strategies that can be used to somehow, limit the impact that those things can have. But you do need to be proactive in planning stuff with your professionals once again.
Now, that's good to hear because I think I would concur that if so long as you can discuss things earlier, you can work out ways to, and sometimes, of course, we're not talking, folks, about anything dodgy here. It just might be, well, look, your bright line test is up on this date. Let's just make sure we're nice and clear of that, and then you'll be able to continue with that sale without any tax consequences. So sometimes just that phone call, well, it could be tens of thousands of dollars of tax that you are saving through reaching out to, phone a friend, right? Call your lawyer, call your accountant, call someone like that, right? Because it could make a huge difference. And it sounds like you've seen that as well there, Felicity. Yeah, okay. All right, so that was, market listings, well-prepared people's tax statements. What about things that we've heard a fair bit in the news about recently, which is sunset clauses? There have been a few sort of scary stories and a couple of sad photos recently in the Herald of those who've been caught by that. And force majeure clauses.
Where's your beret?
Yes, I left it in a cow paddock.
Perfect pronunciation. Yes, so I think what you're referring to is the dreaded stories about off-the-plan transactions where people buy apartments from developers that haven't been built yet. And then in some circumstances, due to the buoyant rising market, that some developers have terminated agreements a long way along in the piece because, and then, with the aim that they can resell them for a higher price. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yes, yep, that sort of thing there. Yeah, with the argument that, well, look, but this is here for both the developer and the client. But we've seen a bit of things recently that suggesting that perhaps a developer had acted more on greed rather than need.
I mean, off-the-plan transactions and agreements are a bit of a minefield. They're very commonplace in New Zealand, but unlike a normal auction or a sale and purchase, there's no set template which is balanced so that it's fair between both parties. And I think it's fair to say that most of the time they're prepared by developers, lawyers, and they're very in favour of developers, and it can be really hard to get any amendments on behalf of purchasers. So I have definitely noticed a trend of certain clauses like the sunset clause, which would traditionally be just for the favour of the purchaser to enable the purchaser to end the contract if there's ridiculous delay on the part of the vendor or the developer. And where now I'm noticing that drafting's coming through whereby that, for example, a sunset clause will favour a developer as well as a purchaser, which is, in my view, not right, which gives the vendor the power to drop out of the contract very late in the piece.
Okay, so I guess it depends. Like I was chatting to Daniel Carney, I saw his comments rather in an article Diana Clement had written for One Roof, and he'd commented they work with developers that are not going to burn off the relationship, etc., for the sake of a few dollars. So I thought, that's interesting. It is very much then caveat emptor, and sometimes, okay, you'll pay a financial advisor and their bill, but perhaps in the big picture, let's say it's $5,000 or $7,000, you pay them whatever. If that saved you $150,000 walk away from a project because of the relationships, well, maybe it's a pretty cheap price to pay. So I thought, yeah, there's a valid comment in going with these good relationships with firms, etc., that have got that, because it's a bit of protection for you.
Oh, for sure. I mean, I always say to clients that, the negotiating the black and white of the contract is one thing, but the most important thing that they can do from a pragmatic perspective, a practical perspective, is to just do as much research as they can into the reputation of the developer and those sorts of practical things.
Right. Okay. So that's good to know. And we're often saying to people, look, if there's one thing you're going to spend money on with a new build, spend it on your lawyer, because if they charge you another $1,000 to review the contract, but it saves you pain later, it's money well spent. So don't skimp there.
For sure.
So we're rooting for your corner.
Thank you, Gareth.
Yeah.
I have had I know that there's also been some interesting situations starting to develop now with off-the-plan transactions because of the building cost increases and so forth, inflation, whatnot. And I've had a situation in the last few weeks where even though it's a fixed price contract, the developer is essentially forcing a $50,000 price increase onto each and every purchaser. And so it's all very well to have a binding contract. So they don't actually have any legal basis to demand that. But the practical reality is that the purchaser can either walk away with their deposit and still no house, or they can agree to it, or they can try and push back and say no, but then live with the uncertainty that the developer will terminate the contract anyway under the force majeure clause because of COVID, or a sunset clause.
Right, okay. So the sunset clauses, how do they differ from the force majeure clauses? What's the difference there?
So a sunset clause, as I said, is traditionally developed for a purchaser to enable a contract. So if a contract goes on if a contract ends up in no man's land because a fundamental thing can't happen, either the legal title is unnecessarily delayed or can never be issued for some technical reason, or, for example, the code compliance certificate for the build, sign off by council, cannot be issued for some reason, which is obviously nothing to do with the purchaser or not in the purchaser's control, then it means that the purchaser at some point in time gives them a mechanism to terminate the contract and get their deposit back and move on. Like I said, the sunset clauses now seem to be coming through such that both parties can rely on that. And then the force majeure, I think it's interesting with COVID. So a force majeure clause gives a solution in the event that the parties can't complete their obligations or undertake their obligations, something that's outside of the parties' war or pandemic, obviously, using the COVID example. Or an act of God like a big a storm or something, or an earthquake. So it's interesting that I think probably lawyers and parties in the past would have tended to not show much attention to force majeure clauses, thinking that it's unlikely that they'll be relevant. But now with COVID, of course, all developers are including COVID as an example of a force majeure circumstance, and it does give developers a lot of power to terminate a transaction at any point in time and just cite COVID as the reason. So it's very important for purchasers that if you can, you need to narrow down that force majeure wording if you can.
Okay, that's a good practical suggestion, because I guess even depending what happens with the wave of Omicron, which years from now, if this is still up and you're watching this, you'll know when this was recorded, that that could perhaps have a large section of the workforce, maybe not super sick, but just off work, unable self-isolating, etc., which could have a real domino effect on a building site. So that's practical advice there. It's interesting,
and even just increased building costs could be blamed on COVID. So it's very broad,
right? Okay.
Potentially.
because the timber yard, half the staff was sick, and then the truck driver was sick, and so on and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, or they just couldn't get supplies because of the supply logistic issues at the moment.
Yeah. You're talking to one of my cousins, he said that they will go to a certain building supply depot and say, all right, we need, 20 of these, and they say, well, you can have 7 of those. And you walk out to the yard, he says he's never seen so much timber in his entire life in the yard. And it's all bundled and spray painted with the names of different builders. He also told me about another builder that they knew who had a barn which was filled floor to ceiling with 4x2, and he's storing that for his builds. So these sort of things are happening, and of course I could understand that particular person, they're trying to perhaps future-proof and look after their clients, but it's having a big flow-on effect on everybody, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, I guess it's analogous to the supermarket runouts.
Yeah. Now, interestingly enough, from a tax point of view, if you're buying property which is off the plans, no title issued, then Bright Line starts when you sign a sale and purchase agreement. So very early date, right?
Mm-hmm. That's a real advantage to that to the agreement.
So there's sort of challenges or risks on one hand, but some advantages. Whereas if it's already issued, then it's not until settlement, which could be quite a late start date. Of course, if it's a new build, maybe that doesn't matter too much, because either way you've still got only a 5-year Bright Line, and you've got 20 years of interest deductibility after that. But it certainly is an advantage. One thing we tend to say, and it'd be good to get your thoughts on this, Felicity, is going for a turnkey property, where you deposit and you're not paying anything more till you can turn the key in the door, tends to weed out the cowboys, as it were, because only the bigger firms have got the capacity to carry that, and during that stage it's a bit more expensive, but perhaps a little bit safer than the progress payment method, where you pay them to fund the next stage of the build. Is that still true, or has that ceased to become true in the current environment?
It seems like there are a lot of people around who are developers doing these kinds of developments of differing sizes. I don't know if I'd really agree with that sentiment. I was talking to a fellow lawyer who is very experienced, and even a few years ago, and he was reflecting on the fact that New Zealand has one of the highest incidents of this off the plan purchasing structures, simply because the construction industry is so undercapitalised. So it makes it a necessity, because they have to sell a certain number of off the plan and get the deposits in to even have any hope of getting finance for the build. So I don't know if that necessarily provides reassurance of their financial stability.
Good point. Okay, now it's really good to get that perspective, because sometimes we can tend to be in our own echo room, or a bit blinkered, as it were, and certainly we appreciate those insights from those that are working in the field, such as yourself. Well, I think that's been very informative. Any final comments that you would like to offer to our dear listeners?
You've got a beautiful French accent, Gareth. First and foremost.
Merci beaucoup.
It's a minefield out. Just make sure that you get professionals who are onto it and who really care, and ring them at the outset rather than halfway through for the best results.
That sounds very practical and very timely advice. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today, Felicity. We'll have, of course, the contact details for the property practice in the description below, and you can click on the link and visit Felicity's website, or give her a call, and she'll be happy to help advise us. You can see she really knows what she's talking about. So thank you so much for sharing some of your expertise with us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me on, Gareth. It's been fun.
Fantastic.